If I could have worked without this accursed disease, what things I might have done. That sentence hangs over almost everything we think we know about Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh has become the modern image of the tortured artist, the painter who saw the world too intensely. The man who gave us sunflowers, wheat fields, cypress trees, and a night sky that looks less like weather than a mind in motion. His life has been documented, romanticized, diagnosed, quoted, sold, and turned into a warning about genius and pain. But the strangest part of his story is not his life, it is his death. On June 27th, 1890, Van Gogh left the small inn where he was staying in Auvers-sur-Oise. According to the traditional story, he walked out toward the fields with a revolver. That night, he returned to the auberge Ravoux with the bullet wound in his torso. 2 days later, with his brother Theo beside him, he was dead. For generations, the answer seemed obvious. Vincent van Gogh killed himself. And in one sense, it was easy to believe. This was the man who had severely mutilated his left ear, probably cutting off most of it, or virtually all of it. The man who had spent time in a psychiatric hospital. The man whose letters could move from tenderness to despair with frightening speed. If history had a role prepared for him, it was this one. The doomed genius destroyed by his own mind. But then the evidence begins to misbehave. The gun was not found on him. His wound was not the immediate wound people imagine when they hear the word suicide. Some researchers have argued that the angle, the distance, and the forensic details point away from a self-inflicted shot. If that is true, the most famous artist's death in modern history may not be what we were told. So, who really killed Vincent van Gogh? To answer that, we cannot begin with the bullet. We have to begin with the reason the bullet was so quickly accepted. Long before Van Gogh became a painter, he was already a man who could not fit inside the life other people had prepared for him. At 16, he entered the art trade, working for the international firm Goupil et Compagnie. It looked respectable: paintings, dealers, collectors, money, and the polite machinery that turns art into property. But Vincent was not built for that machinery. In London, he read, visited museums, and absorbed the work of painters who gave dignity to peasants and laborers. In Paris, he became increasingly religious. The business of selling art began to feel empty, maybe even corrupt. In 1876, Goupil dismissed him. That failure was not only professional. For Vincent, failures had a way of becoming spiritual. He worked as a teacher and then as a bookseller, then tried to prepare for theology. Again and again, he searched for a calling large enough to contain his intensity. Again and again, the world answered with rejection. Finally, he went to Borinage, a poor mining region in Belgium, as a lay preacher. There, his devotion became almost frightening. He lived among miners and their families, slept on the floor, gave away his possessions, and tried to share their poverty so completely that people later called him the Christ of the coal mine. Even that was not enough. The church did not renew his position. By then, the shape of the tragedy was already forming. A man with violent sincerity keeps offering himself to the world, and the world keeps handing him back. This is why the suicide story had power. Not because the evidence was complete, but because his life had already been made to sound like an explanation. Join us on Amazing Talker. It's our one-on-one tutoring platform. You can find a tutor to learn about English or history or any other subject. Our tutors are from all around the world and speak your native language. More than 1 million students have joined us already, making us one of the largest learning platforms online. So if you're interested in learning languages, just click on the link below and register to get $10 off. At Saint-Rémy, Van Gogh did something that complicates every lazy version of his story. He kept working. This is where the myth of the mad genius becomes especially dangerous. It makes suffering look like fuel, as if the illness painted the paintings for him. That sounds poetic until you remember that illness does not stretch a canvas, mix a color, or stand outside in the heat studying a cypress tree until the light changes. Van Gogh worked because he was trying to stay alive. During his year at the asylum, he produced around 150 paintings. On good days, he painted in the walled garden. Later, he was allowed to work outside the institution. The hospital even gave him an extra room to use as a studio. But the good days were not stable ground. They were islands. They were also periods of frightening confusion. At one point, he reportedly tried to eat, paint, and turpentine. After that, he was restricted for a time to drawing. Think about how severe that must have felt for a painter whose whole method depended on color. For Van Gogh, color was not decoration, it was language. To be kept away from paint was almost like being told to breathe more quietly, and yet he kept trying to recover. That is the part we often skip. The months before his death were not a straight line downward. They were a fight. He was not simply walking toward an inevitable ending. He was making plans, producing work, writing letters, moving places, searching for a way to live with a mind he could not fully trust. This is why the final phase of his life feels so unsettling. In May 1890, Van Gogh left Saint-Rémy and moved to Auvers-sur-Oise. The village had several advantages. It was close to Paris, which meant he could see his brother Theo more easily, and had a community of artists. And it had Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician known for his interests in artists and nervous illness. On paper, Auvers looked like a reset button. Van Gogh arrived on May 20. He took a small room at the Auberge. The rent was modest. The countryside was full of subjects: fields, cottages, gardens, trees, roads bending under the sky. If Saint-Rémy had been a locked room, Auvers looked like an open window. For a while, he seemed better. He worked at an astonishing pace, that almost a painting a day. That fact is often treated like a proof of genius, and yes, it is extraordinary, but it also has a slightly frightening edge. Imagine someone trying to empty an entire storm through a paintbrush before the weather turns again. In those 70 days, Van Gogh painted wheat fields, village streets, portraits, flowers, gardens, houses. His paintings from Auvers can feel restless, as if every surface is vibrating. Even when the subject is calm, the brushwork is not calm. The sky seems to move, the grass seems to twitch, the road seems to remember footsteps that have not yet arrived. And then Theo's life began to change. Theo Van Gogh was not just Vincent's brother, he was Vincent's financial support, emotional anchor, art world connection, and closest witness. If Vincent was a ship in bad weather, Theo was the harbor. That sounds beautiful until you realize how terrifying it is to depend on one harbor for everything. Theo had a wife. He had a newborn son, also named Vincent. He was considering leaving his stable position and starting an independent business. For Theo, this may have been ambition, pressure, adulthood, the normal chaos of trying to build a life. For Vincent, it may have felt like the floor moving. If Theo's finances became unstable, what happened to Vincent? If Theo had a family to support, what did that make Vincent? A brother, a responsibility, a burden? The Van Gogh Museum notes that after visiting Theo in early July, Vincent became deeply worried about his own economic future. Around July 10th, in the official Van Gogh Letters translation, he wrote, "What can be done? You see, I usually try to be quite good-humored, but my life, too, is attacked. At the very root, my step is faltering." That is not the language of a man who feels secure. Then, on July 23rd, 4 days before the shooting, he wrote a letter that was never sent. It is one of the most haunting documents in the story. In it, he thanks Theo for sending money, but the tone turns heavy. In the official Van Gogh Letters translation, he writes, "I'd really like to write to you about many things, but I sense the pointlessness of it." Near the end, he writes, well, I risked my life for my own work, and my reason has half floundered in it." Very well. That sentence is hard to read without hearing a door close somewhere. But again, we have to be careful. A dark letter is not a death certificate. A desperate sentence is not a confession. People in pain can write frightening things and still want to live the next morning. Anyone who has ever been depressed, exhausted, broke, or ashamed knows that the worst thought you have at midnight is not always the plan you follow at dawn. So when we arrive at July 27, we arrive with two truths in our hands. First, Van Gogh has reasons to be in crisis. Second, crisis alone does not tell us what happened in that field. This is where the story turns from art history into something closer to forensic investigation. And before we follow the bullet, we need to set one rule for the rest of the story. A mystery is not the same thing as conspiracy. A conspiracy begins with the answer and goes shopping for clues. A mystery begins with the clues and admits when the answer is incomplete. That distinction matters here because Van Gogh's death attracts both serious scholarship and very lazy speculation. One side wants the beautiful tragedy, the misunderstood genius, alone in the wheat, choosing death. The other side wants the shocking reversal, the innocent artist, shot by someone else, then blamed by history. Both versions are emotionally satisfying in different ways, but evidence does not exist to satisfy us. It exists to interrupt us. So, as we go through the final evidence, keep asking one question. Does this detail actually prove something? Or does it only feel meaningful because it fits the movie already playing in our heads? A missing gun sounds suspicious, but 19th century rural France was not a modern crime scene with yellow tape, body cameras, and a forensic team waiting politely behind the wheat. A dying man's word sounds decisive, but dying people can be confused, protective, ashamed, resigned, or simply trying to stop others from asking questions. This is why the case is so hard. Almost every clue points somewhere. Almost every clue can also be pulled back. The traditional version says that Van Gogh went out with a revolver and shot himself. Some accounts place him in a wheat field. Wounded, he returned to Auvers-sur-Oise, where he eventually told people he had tried to kill himself. Theo came from Paris the next day and stayed with him. Vincent died on July 29th. That version is still the mainstream position, and the Van Gogh Museum strongly rejects the theory that he was shot by boys. But in 2011, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographers Stephen Naifeh and Gregory White-Smith brought an alternative theory into public conversation through their book, Van Gogh, The Life. Their claim, widely reported by outlets including the BBC, was not that Van Gogh was murdered in the clean, dramatic way a movie villain murders someone. And it should be said clearly, this theory remains highly contested, and the Van Gogh Museum rejects it. Their theory was messier. They suggest he may have been shot accidentally by two teenage boys he knew. One name often linked to the story is René Secretan, who, as a young boy, had reportedly dressed like a cowboy, carried a faulty gun, and teased Van Gogh. In this version, the shooting may have happened during some reckless encounter, possibly involving drinking, mockery, or a gun that should never have been in anyone's hand. Then, according to the theory, Van Gogh protected the boys by accepting the death as his own act. Now, that is a powerful story, almost too powerful. It gives us a victim, a secret, a cover-up, and a final act of tragic mercy. It is the kind of theory that instantly makes a documentary producer sit up straighter. But good stories are not always true. So, what is the evidence that made people take it seriously? One issue is the gun. If Van Gogh shot himself, where did the revolver come from? Why was it not recovered from him at the inn? Why were his painting materials not clearly found with him? In a straightforward suicide case, you expect certain objects to tell a relatively simple story: weapon, body, scene. Here the objects were strangely slippery. Another issue is the wound. The fatal injury was not a dramatic shot to the head or a heart. It was a gunshot wound to the torso, described in a forensic discussion as involving the abdomen. That does not make suicide impossible, but it does raise questions. Self-inflicted gunshots are often chosen for immediate lethality. A wound like this can produce a long, painful death. Van Gogh survived roughly 30 hours. Then there is the question of distance and angle. A 2020 article in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology re-examined the case and argued that, based on the available circumstantial evidence and the author's interpretation of firearm testing, Van Gogh's fatal wound was unlikely to have been self-inflicted. The authors were careful about the limits of the evidence. After 130 years, there is no definitive autopsy that can settle everything. But their medical opinion was that homicide was more probable than suicide. That does not prove murder, but it does show why the case refuses to stay buried. The most disturbing part is not one single clue. It is the way the clues create discomfort when placed together. A missing gun, an unusual wound, a man who walks home instead of dying at the scene, a village with boys who may have had access to a pistol, a dying artist with a history of self-harm, making his own testimony easy to accept and hard to challenge. If the statement reported to the end was accurate, that is significant. If that statement was made while protecting someone else, that would also be significant. And because he died, we cannot ask the follow-up question. This is the cruelest thing about historical mysteries. They do not just lack answers, they lack the possibility of asking better questions. At this point, the alternative theory can feel seductive. It seems to rescue Van Gogh from the old cliché. It says, wait, maybe he was not the doomed madman everyone imagined. Maybe something happened to him. Maybe the world did not merely misunderstand him. Maybe someone hurt him, and then history blamed him for his own death. Emotionally, that theory is very tempting, but the case for suicide is stronger than many people want it to be. Dr. Paul Gachet, who saw Van Gogh after the shooting, wrote very soon afterward that Vincent had wounded himself. Later, he used the word suicide. Theo, who spent the final hours with his brother, wrote to his wife, Jo, that Vincent's words included the idea that this was how he wanted to go. Émile Bernard, a friend of Van Gogh, also wrote after the funeral that Vincent had killed himself and had done it lucidly. These are not random tourists. These are people close to the event, people living in the immediate aftermath, people whose letters form part of the historical record. The art newspaper, in a recent defense of the suicide interpretation, uses these kinds of letters to argue that the murder or accidental shooting story is a myth. Its point is simple. The people nearest to Van Gogh's final days believed he had killed himself. That matters. But it still does not make the ending emotionally easy. Because even if suicide is the most likely explanation, the usual story is still incomplete. It often turns Van Gogh's death into destiny, as if the bullet had been waiting for him since Arles, since Saint-Rémy, since the first brushstroke people later called genius. That is the part we should resist. Van Gogh did not die because artists must suffer. He did not die because sunflowers require misery. He did not die so future museums could sell posters with a tragic backstory attached. He died after a period of illness, fear, economic dependence, family pressure, and isolation. He died in a world that had no language for mental health as we understand it now. No modern crisis care, no stable safety net for a person whose ability to function could vanish without warning. And perhaps, depending on which theory you find more convincing, he may also have died because a weapon entered a situation where it should never have been. Either way, the violence is larger than the gunshot. It is in the way people mocked him. It is in the way his illness became entertainment. It is in the way poverty made every decision heavier. It is in the way his dependence on Theo turned love into pressure. It is in the way posterity took the most painful acts of his life and arranged them into a myth that was easy to market. He understood instability, but he also understood attention. He looked at ordinary things, chairs, boots, bedrooms, orchards, crows, wheat, and treated them as if they deserved the full force of a human soul. That is the tragedy behind the tragedy. A man who paid such attention to the world has been remembered through a story that often pays too little attention to him. So, did Vincent van Gogh kill himself? The honest answer is that the mainstream historical position still says yes. The Van Gogh Museum supports the suicide interpretation and rejects the boys with a gun theory as unfounded. Several close contemporary accounts point in the same direction. If this were a court of probability, suicide would still have serious evidence behind it, but there are questions that do not disappear just because a conclusion is probable. The forensic doubts, the missing weapon, the strange wound, and the alternative theory raised by Nefe and Smith all reveal something important. Not necessarily that the official story is false, but that the official story became simple long before it became fully understood. And maybe that is the real lesson. We should be careful with dead people who become symbols. Symbols are useful. They make stories travel. They also flatten human beings. Van Gogh becomes the tortured genius. Sylvia Plath becomes an oven. Marilyn Monroe becomes a blonde tragedy. Amy Winehouse becomes a warning label. The more famous the pain becomes, the less room the person has left inside it. Van Gogh's death will probably never be solved in the way a modern investigation can be solved. There was no full forensic scene preservation, no definitive autopsy capable of answering every question we now have, no clean chain of evidence, only letters, memories, later interpretations, and a body that was buried before the 20th century had even begun. So we are left with something less satisfying than certainty. We are left with responsibility. Responsibility is to say what the evidence supports. Responsibility to say what remains disputed. Responsibility not to turn mental illness into a decorative frame around genius, and responsibility not to force a murder mystery onto a man simply because tragedy feels more cinematic when someone else holds the gun. Vincent van Gogh spent his last years trying to make the world visible. Not prettier, not easier, visible. Maybe we owe him the same thing. And that also means resisting to one more temptation, turning uncertainty itself into entertainment. The internet loves unsolved deaths because they let us play detective without paying the emotional cost of the death itself. But Van Gogh is not a puzzle box. He is not a plot twist waiting for a thumbnail. He was a man who wrote to his brother, worried about money, feared relapse, wanted his work to matter, and kept painting even when stability kept slipping away from him. So the question is not only who fired the gun, it is also why did this man reach a point where either explanation feels possible? That question is harder to answer. It has no villain simple enough for a comment section. It asks us to look at care, poverty, loneliness, family dependence, public humiliation, and the terrible gap between being talented and being safe. Not a legend, not a slogan, a clear look. And if you still find yourself staring at the end of his life, unsure whether you are seeing suicide, accident, sacrifice, illness, or some terrible mixture of all of them, that uncertainty may be the most honest place to stand, because the final violence against Vincent van Gogh would be pretending that a life this painful, this productive, and this human can be explained by one sentence. So I want to leave you with a few questions. After hearing both sides, which version feels more convincing to you? The traditional suicide account, supported by the letters of people closest to Van Gogh, or the alternative theory that something happened in that field that was never fully understood? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this episode made you see Van Gogh differently, give us a like, share, and subscribe.